Religious schools in the U.S., should they receive taxpayer funding? The Supreme Court's actually already weighed in on this, but it seems like in Oklahoma, they're questioning that. Here to explain is Lori Windham. She's at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Lori, thanks for joining us.
Casey, thanks so much for having me on.
When I saw this story come in, I was pretty surprised because I actually thought the Supreme Court recently settled this issue, but now we're doing it all over again. Can you just explain for us what's happening in Oklahoma more recently that is restarting this battle over federal funding for religious schools?
Sure. So Oklahoma, like many states, has a lot of different options for families who are in need of better school choices. This is especially true for families who live in rural areas of the state who might not have access to really good public schools, or who may have to travel a long distance to reach any school. And so one option that Oklahoma makes available are publicly funded charter schools, including online options that families could use if they're living far away from a school. And so St. Isidore Catholic School applied for this program. They were granted by the state the ability to participate and provide a free education for Oklahoma families who needed it. And then Oklahoma's state attorney general actually turned around and sued the state charter board, saying, you can't do that. This is a religious school, and tried to kick them out of the charter program. And now that case has arrived at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay. Yeah, kind of surprising this is happening in Oklahoma. This sounds like something that would happen in like New York or California. So I remember covering a few years ago, there was a couple of cases. One, there was in Maine. I think the other was New York, but I'm not exactly sure. And they were around the same issue. There was a religious preschool. They wanted to participate in a state program that basically gave playground improvements to schools. And this religious preschool applied and said, hey, we want this grant. It's a good school, whatever. And the school was denied simply because it's a religious school. They said, we cannot give funding to religious schools, right? And they challenged that. And then they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, actually, you cannot deny a school just because they are a religious school for funding. And that seems pretty apt here. Am I missing something? It seemed like kind of open and shut to me, but
I think maybe you should be the new solicitor, the Attorney General of Oklahoma case. So I think
it's your endorsement.
Is obvious. Yeah, this issue has actually been up to the Supreme Court 3 times in recent years. And every single time the Supreme Court has said, no, you can't exclude religious schools just because they are religious. Now, what's interesting here, and one thing that the Becket Fund made clear in its friend of the court brief for the Supreme Court, is that even though the Supreme Court has said this again and again, there are a lot of state and local officials who haven't gotten the message. And so even after those 3 Supreme Court decisions saying, yes, religious schools can participate on an equal basis with everyone else, we have Colorado attempting to exclude religious preschools. We have Minnesota attempting to exclude religious colleges who provide classes for high school students. We have Maine, yet again, who lost at the Supreme Court and then went back and changed its rules and said, no, now we really can exclude the religious schools. And so, unfortunately, we have seen this recalcitrant attitude on the part of states across the country.
So it would make sense. It kind of follows that there's some random state official who's a little zealous and doesn't know the precedent. But the judges in these states should, and especially the state Supreme Courts. What arguments are they making at the judicial level to circumvent this? Did the Oklahoma Supreme Court rule against the school as well? I mean, what are they saying that is getting around this?
The Oklahoma Supreme Court did rule against the charter school, which was a surprise. And the loophole that some of these states are using is to say that, well, once you've accepted this funding, once you become part of this state program, you're not a private school anymore. You're actually a public school. You belong to the state. You're an arm of the state, and you can't be religious if you're an arm of the state. The problem with that is that argument's been tried before and it's lost. Maine tried a version of that in its case before the Supreme Court just a couple of years ago, and they lost. And way back in the 1980s. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court about a private school that served disabled children and received a lot of state funding because there's ample funding to ensure a good education for those children. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're not a state actor. You're not part of the state. You're still a private school. You still have the rights of a private school. And yet this issue keeps coming up.
Yeah, and this is multiple different religions. This isn't all just Christian schools or something. This is there's Jewish schools are concerned about this. Other religious schools. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how this is even happening. What is the motivating factor behind trying to be so punitive to these small religious schools that really can't defend themselves, that have often very little funding. They don't have access to all that state money. So it's often parents or some donors, keeping this thing afloat. Why are they going after these schools when sometimes they're like the best option for education in their neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we would like to know. I think part of the problem is for a long time, you had a string of Supreme Court cases under the Establishment Clause taking a very broad, overly broad view of the idea of the separation of church and state and saying, oh, that means we can't even send a dime of money to a religious school that might entangle the state and the church. In recent years, the Supreme Court has realized that no, that's not how the First Amendment was envisioned. That is not our history and tradition within the United States. And those old bad cases are no longer good law. You don't have to follow them. And yet we see state officials in many places who are still stuck in the 1980s and still want to apply these old rules and say, no more money could go to religious schools. Also, sometimes you have state officials who just want to keep a really tight rein on their money. And so they exclude schools that otherwise really ought to be included because they're providing great options for families.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So just kind of last question. What is the future? Supreme Court's definitely going to look at this. When can we expect a ruling? As we wrap up, what's the look ahead here?
Well, the Supreme Court will hear arguments on this case in April. We expect a ruling from them by the end of June. And at Becket, we are very hopeful that they're going to rule once again that religious schools can participate in state programs on the same basis as everyone else.
I think this exact same court makeup has already considered this almost exact same case. So it'd be really interesting to watch. Thanks so much, Lori, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Casey. It's great to see you.